Hello and welcome to our second week of our Advent journey. This week we are going to be exploring the theme of faith and how faith impacts this time of waiting as we wait and yearn for the second coming of Jesus. Now, what is faith? When was the last time you had to describe it to someone? As I was mulling over this word over these last several weeks, preparing for this study, I was thinking about how hard it can actually be to describe what faith actually is. I have faith. I know what its impacts in my life are and in the impacts of faith on my relationship with God. But to describe it, well, that's a little bit of a more tricky situation. So the first thing that I think of when I think of the word faith is the definition of faith that we have in Hebrews 11. Now, if you remember, Hebrews 11 is filled with stories of the people from the Old Testament and their faith and how they lived that out. So let's see this definition here at the beginning of chapter 11 in Hebrews. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. And I like the way the NLT phrases it, the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen. And what follows this intro definition here is snapshots. We have snapshots of the faith of men and women from Israel's history. So from Abraham to Moses to Joshua to Rahab, they're all in this so-called hall of faith. And after reading through all of these snapshots of faith from these people from the Old Testament, the writer of Hebrews concludes like this in verse 39. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. These men and women, this cloud of witnesses that went before us, who lived out their faith imperfectly because they were imperfect humans. They had faith. They were confident that God would fulfill his promises, that what they hoped for would actually happen. This confident assurance that God was at work in their midst, even though, like Jeremiah, they didn't get to completely experience the fulfillment of all that God has promised. This is enduring faith, faith that can weather all the storms of life, the celebrations, the low points, the bad times, the good times, all of it, enduring faith. We are going to examine the faith of one such person today as we continue our journey through Advent, and that is Zechariah. Luke tells his story at the beginning of his gospel. So turn to Luke chapter 1, and we're going to explore this story. Now, Zechariah was a priest. Luke tells us he is from the priestly line of Abijah, and that Elizabeth, his wife, was also a descendant from Aaron. So they are a priestly family. They're described as devout and righteous, but they're also described as childless and very old. Now, we had a professor in seminary, and he always liked to remind us that whenever you see a woman who is barren in Scripture, to pay attention because something is about to happen. God is up to something. And so as faithful readers of Scripture, we should all be leaning in at this point to see what's about to happen. Now, one day, Luke tells us that Zechariah is on duty at the temple. It's his turn to serve. And so he has gone to Jerusalem and he is serving in the temple. And while he is serving, he is chosen by Lot to go in and burn incense before the Lord. And all the other people were going to stay outside and pray. And while he is there before the altar of incense, God sends an angel who appears standing right there beside the altar. And Zechariah is just overwhelmed with fear. He's terrified. I mean, I kind of understand it. If I'm praying and all of a sudden there is an angel standing there, I mean, there's a reason why most people in Scripture, when they encounter an angel, are responding with fear. One, because they kind of appear as if from nowhere. And two, I think they probably looked a little bit intimidating. They're not like these sweet little cherubs that we see little figurines of. They're pretty intimidating figures. So the angel shows up and he greets Zechariah and tells him, "Don't be afraid, Zechariah, because the Lord has heard your prayer and your wife is going to have a son." And I imagine Zechariah at this point is like, already overwhelmed by the angel appearing and probably trembling all over. And now he's hearing these words as if he wasn't already overwhelmed. Maybe he's like putting out a hand to steady himself against the wall. I mean, what would you do? That's probably what I would be doing. I'd be shaking. By the way, you're going to have a son, and this son is going to prepare the way for the Lord. Prepare the people for his coming. And you're going to name him John. Now, if you're Zechariah, how are you feeling right now? Imagine all of the long years of waiting and longing to have a child. And then to realize that the time for childbearing has passed. That there's no hope of that. It's just not going to happen. And then to have an angel show up and tell you the very thing that you think is impossible is going to happen. No wonder he responds in disbelief. Zechariah's question to the angel gives us a peek at the doubt growing in his heart. How can I be sure of this? I am old and my wife is well along in years. He doesn't believe that this can be true. And it's at this point that I imagine the angel growing a little bit taller and even more intimidating, if that's possible, and saying, I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to tell you this good news. And now you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words. Mic drop. Zechariah was struggling to believe, and he was eyeball to eyeball with Gabriel. He struggled to believe what the angel came to tell him. But that's not where his story ends. God doesn't leave him there doubting. I imagine Zechariah during those silent months leading up to John's birth, wrestling and dwelling in the presence of God. And God meeting him in that moment and place of doubt and pulling him forward. So that when John is born, the time comes, Zechariah doesn't miss this moment. Instead, I imagine as he is looking on his son who has just been born, and his faith is finally coming to sight right there. The words that Gabriel spoke are coming true. And he's responding in faith. So that 8 days later, when it's time to name the child, he says his name is John. He writes it down because he can't speak yet. And then he is able to speak. He moves from a place of doubt to a place of faith. God didn't leave Zechariah floundering in his doubt. Instead, God met him there, right in the midst of this waiting time for his son to be born. He met him in his doubt, and he moved him forward to a place of faith. And God does the same for us. He meets us where we are. Maybe we're in a place of doubt or uncertainty. We found ourselves in a hard time, and we're struggling to see how God's at work. But he meets us there, and he doesn't just leave us. He's with us in those moments of doubt, and he walks with us through that, calling us to an ever deepening faith. And he does this over and over again as we encounter life struggles and we find times where we perhaps are struggling to have faith. But that faith that endures can take some doubt and wrestles with it, struggles forward, and allows God to pull us forward to an ever deepening faith. So my hope and my prayer for us as we walk through this Advent season is that we will have an enduring faith, because that is the kind of faith that impacts us as we are waiting. And is the kind of faith that pulls us forward in the story that God is writing, because he is always at work in our midst. And may you have the faith that the writer of Hebrews speaks of, the confidence and the assurance that what God has promised will actually happen. And may you dwell in his presence this week.